Hello, my name is Ellie Baumstein from the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Welcome to this National Good Food Network webinar entitled Findings of the 2017 National Food Hub Survey. The Wallace Center is especially pleased to host this webinar. We've worked in partnership with Michigan State University for 3 biannual studies and are so excited to see the trends that are arising from longer-term data collection. The food hub sector is growing up, and this survey has a lot to teach us about evolution in the sector. It's exciting to see food hubs becoming more sophisticated, but there are still lots of challenges, which we'll hear more about from Kathryn Colasanti and Rich Pirog of Michigan State University during the webinar. Before I hand the mic over to our friends from Michigan State, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Wallace Center. The Wallace Center is a unit of Winrock International and has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 30 years. We focus on developing partnerships, piloting new ideas, and advancing regional solutions to strengthen communities through resilient farming and food systems. The National Good Food Network is an initiative of the Wallace Center that accelerates progress toward the Wallace Center's vision. You can learn more about the work of the Wallace Center at wallacecenter.org and more about NGFN at ngfn.org. You can dig into over a decade's worth of our great resources, including our large collection of archived webinars. Our first presenter is Rich Pirog, who will begin the webinar by giving us a bit of history and background on the National Food Hub Survey. Rich Pirog is director at the Center for Regional Food Systems at Michigan State University. He's responsible for the strategic direction, management, and achievement of mission for the center. The center's work includes food hubs, farm to school and farm to early childhood education, healthy food access and financing, food policy councils, and beginning and organic farming. From 1990 to 2011, Rich was Associate Director and Program Leader for Marketing and Food Systems at the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Iowa. Pirog's recent writings and research include impacts of local foods, evolution of the local food movement, structural racism present in the U.S. food system, and building networks to address social, health, and economic challenges in the food system. Rich, I'll hand the mic to you for a little history and context.
Thank you very much, Ellie. My role here is just to give you some perspective about the survey history and why we've done this. Just very briefly, the Center for Regional Food Systems was initiated in 2012. We've had a close working relationship with the Wallace Center, not only on this survey, but many other projects, food hub related, over the last 6 years. And we are really privileged and excited to be very involved in this survey since its inception. So a little bit of history here. Like any sector, the food hub sector is an evolving one that sort of has developed out of the local food movement as we've moved towards more intermediated markets and looked at scaling up local food. As local food is scaled up, so has the emergence and development and maturation of food hubs. In 2011, the USDA and Wallace Center conducted a small survey to provide some initial insights on food hubs. And there was a desire to conduct a more robust and comprehensive national food hub survey to better assess the state of food hubs in the state, because again, that's how we learn about the progress of a particular local food sector, and in the case of food hubs. So out of that 2011 survey, conversations ensued, and the Wallace Center and the Center for Regional Food Systems at MSU agreed to work collectively and collect data through a national survey on food hubs. And so the first report, the findings of the 2000 National Food Hub Survey, was the first of what has now become 3 national surveys conducted every 2 years. We conducted the second survey in 2015, adding a few questions, further refining some of the existing questions that we already were using, and those results were published in 2016. And I'm the primary presenter, Kathryn Colasanti, will mention authors and who else was involved. So fast forward to 2017, and Wallace and the Center for Regional Food Systems agreed again to continue the survey. and we added a few additional questions. We refined some of the existing questions based on what we were receiving previously, and we're very pleased here in this webinar to present the overall findings of the third of these national surveys. So you'll also be getting information about the actual report itself, which you can find through the link that Ellie told you about. Again, we appreciate the partnership with the Wallace Center. I'm very pleased to introduce one of our staff at the Center for Regional Food Systems, Kathryn Colasanti. Kathryn has been with the center for about a decade, and Kathryn has been one of the architects of the Michigan Good Food Charter. When we talk about good food, we talk about food that's healthy, fair, affordable, and green. Kathryn has been a leader in that work and has also been a leader in our work here in Michigan around how we measure what we mean by good food and the progress in the Michigan Good Food Charter. And she was willing to work along with Jill Hardy, who is one of the co-authors of this survey and was the lead author in 2015, to take the lead in the writing of the report for the 2017 survey. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Kathryn Colasanti, who will provide that overview of the 2017 survey results. Kathryn.
Great, thank you, Rich. My audio okay for everybody?
Yep, sound good.
All right, thanks, Kathryn.
All right, great. So Ellie, if you can go to the next slide. Before I dive in, I want to just be sure to recognize the team of people behind this report. As Rich said, Jill Hardy had a big role, and she's with us on the webinar today and will be available once we get to questions. But a team of co-authors and several reviewers who gave very helpful input on early drafts of the report. Also, I wanted to give a special shout out to our designer, Julia Fiorello, who did a great job helping us reimagine the executive summary and working through the design on a tight timeline. But this is a big project, and I certainly couldn't have brought it to fruition without a team of people pitching in. All right, next slide. So before getting into findings, I want to briefly cover methods behind the survey. As Rich said, this is a biennial survey, and by replicating this every 2 years, we have an opportunity to expand our understanding of Food Hub trends over time by providing comparable data points. This year, the survey was administered during a 3-month period of 2017, February, March, and April. It was web-based survey. If you do want to see a full copy of the survey tool, that is available on our website with the link listed there. The invitation to complete the survey was sent to 542 key Food Hub personnel in the US, collectively representing 394 different food hubs. And that database of contacts came from respondents to the 2013 and 2015 surveys, so our previous surveys, as well as the USDA Food Hub Directory and the National Good Food Network Food Hub database, so a compilation of those data sources. Of course, we had more individuals this survey was sent to than food hubs, but when multiple individuals received the survey, we ultimately only included one survey for each food hub in the analysis. Next slide. So ultimately, we had 130 food hubs respond to the invitation, giving us a response rate of 33%, and one additional individual who was associated with a food hub that we didn't initially have in our contact database responded via the generic survey link. So in the end, we ended up with 131 completed or partial surveys. Just for comparison, in 2015, we had 151. In 2013, 107. So this latest survey is a little bit larger sample than 2013, a little smaller than 2015. Within that pool, we have 31 hubs that responded to all 3 years of the survey. And there's at least one analysis later I'll point out that looks at that subset of hubs where we have longitudinal data. So this map you have shows the region of the survey respondents. So we had fairly strong geographic diversity and hubs located in all 9 census geographic regions. Next slide. So a few caveats to keep in mind. Our sample represents about 1/3 of the food hubs out there, at least the ones that we know about. So it's certainly a solid proportion, but it's not everyone. It is possible our sample overrepresents wholesale and hybrid hubs and may underrepresent direct-to-consumer hubs. This would seem to be the case if we compare our sample with the working list of active food hubs identified by the Wallace Center and USDA Rural Development. However, I will point out that the categories of hybrid, wholesale, direct-to-consumer are not necessarily absolute, and they can overlap. For example, in our sample, we saw that of the 46 hubs that identified as wholesale, 17 of those said they also sell directly to consumers. So sometimes there's some fluidity between those categories. But just a note that might want to interpret with a grain of salt. Another potential caveat is that respondents do tend to drop off as the survey progresses. It's a long survey. Some of the questions require documentation that maybe not all hubs have readily available. So some of the more difficult questions towards the end of the survey, we had fewer responses. And we do tend to see that more profitable hubs complete more of the survey. So there might be some skew there. But all that said, ultimately, we're confident that the survey provides an overall representative picture of food hubs in the United States. And now with the ability to look across 3 years of survey data, we can see that many of the findings are consistent across survey years, even though a substantial majority of respondents are different each year. So what this indicates then is that we're getting good representation each year and that our sample is a pretty good match to the broader population of food hubs. Also, each year we've adjusted the survey tool to get progressively better data and more accurately capture some of the finer points of food hub finances and practices. So next slide, with that snapshot of methods and limitations, let's go ahead and dive into the findings. Next slide. So first, a note on navigation. If you've already looked at the report, you will have seen that we've used 2 different strategies for organizing the findings. In the executive summary, we've pulled together findings from across topics under the umbrella of what we're calling core concepts, so trying to synthesize the data to highlight some of the key trends that we're seeing overall. And those core concepts are what you see on the right hand of your screen. The main body of the report, on the other hand, follows the topic areas that were used in both the 2013 and 2015 reports. And that's what's on the left hand of your screen. And I'm going to use these topic areas to organize the presentation of findings on the webinar so that we can get into the findings with a little more depth than the executive summary. Next slide. So starting then with operational characteristics. And next slide. So in looking at years in operation first, the range across our sample was between operating less than 1 year to more than 50 years. We can see consistently across the 3 surveys that the majority of hubs have been operating less than 10 years. So overall, this is a young industry. But in 2017, we see more hubs proportionately falling in that 6 to 10 year band in orange and fewer falling in the 0 to 2 year band in the dark blue. So it seems to indicate that the growth in new hubs may be slowing, but previously existing food hub operations are continuing to operate. In all 3 survey years, food hub revenue was significantly correlated with the age of the food hub. And in some ways, this is not surprising. Most businesses either become more profitable over time or cease operations, but does speak to the overall viability of the sector. Next slide. So our survey data offers 3 different ways to classify food hubs: by business model, by legal structure, and by enterprise type. So by business model, looking at the types of customers food hubs are selling to, hybrid hubs were most common in our sample. By legal structure, nonprofits were most common. And then by enterprise type, we see a pretty even split across 3 categories. And by enterprise type, we're looking at the extent to which a hub is structured to maximize profit versus achieve social or environmental goals. And that was a new question on the 2017 survey, but we did see to some extent that enterprise type was correlated with social mission activities, which we'll talk about a little later. Next slide. So turning now to employees and volunteers, notice how consistent the mean and median for the number of food hub employees is across all 3 survey years. That's the middle rows of that table at the top. Also comparing all hubs in the green columns to food hubs operating for more than 2 years. In the blue columns, we see that older hubs had a slightly higher median and mean number of employees in each survey year. So what that's indicating then is as food hubs mature, they're creating new jobs. If we look at the kinds of jobs food hubs offer, in 2017, nearly half, 47% of food hub employees held non-management full-time year-round positions. In 2017, we also saw a decreasing reliance on unpaid staff, both overall, as you see in that bar chart, and within specific subcategories. So when we looked specifically at unpaid interns, at volunteers, at co-op members, and occasional volunteers, so regular volunteers and occasional volunteers, both, all of those subcategories declined in 2017. So some of this could just reflect sampling error, the hubs that we happen to catch in this year's survey, but it also seems consistent with the overall narrative we're seeing in the data, which is more hubs that have been operating longer, are creating more jobs, and utilizing fewer unpaid staff. Next slide. In looking at food hub managers' background and experience, we see that managers tend to have more years of experience in strategic planning and management and fewer years of experience in areas more specifically related to food supply chain like retail and processing, warehousing, marketing, production. Also, the proportion of managers with experience in production and food processing decreased from previous survey years. So this then would imply a market for training opportunities in these areas. And indeed, we've seen that play out with applicants to the University of Vermont Food Hub Management Certificate Program. Many of the newer food hub managers had little to no formal food business or food value chain training. The other change that we're seeing over time is that newer food hubs are tending to attract managers with more formal education. So for example, when we use data across the 3 surveys to compare food hubs established after 2012 and before 2012, we saw that a significantly larger proportion of managers at new hubs had graduate degrees, 53%, compared to managers at hubs established before 2012, which was 35%. But overall, we're definitely seeing a trend towards more formal education. In 2017, among all hubs, 82% of managers had completed a 4-year graduate or professional degree, compared with 71% in 2015. Next slide. So a significant part of the value of food hubs is their ability to establish markets for beginning and small to mid-sized producers. And we've seen that borne out in survey data. Overall, 91% of hubs reported sourcing from farms or ranches that are not owned or managed by the hub, so not their own farms or ranches. And almost half of hub suppliers, on average, began business in the last 10 years. That's how we define beginning. And then 89% of hubs indicated that most or all of their farm and ranch suppliers were small or mid-sized, defined as gross sales less than $500,000 annually. And also of note, the majority of hubs have plans to increase their purchases. Have indicated increasing their purchases from small and mid-sized farms in the preceding 2 years. Next slide. So then turning to product categories that food hubs offer, we see that fresh produce and meat, poultry, fish remain the most important categories. And that's indicated both by those are the categories carried by the largest proportion of hubs, and also those are the categories that compose the largest proportions of food hub sales, as you see in that figure there. However, we may be seeing a trend towards some additional diversification, some movement towards the other categories representing larger proportions of gross sales if you compare 2015 and 2017. Overall, hubs reported carrying an average of 5 different product categories. Direct-to-consumer hubs tended to carry more product carries with an average of 7. All right, next slide. And as you know, food hubs can offer a wide array of different services and activities beyond their direct transactions. And our survey data helps to shed light on which of these are most prevalent. Most of us think of aggregation and distribution as core activities of a food hub. That's reflected in the findings. Interesting to note here that in comparing value-added services in 2017 compared to 2013, packaging and repackaging and product storage, so those 2 categories, both increased sharply. So what you're seeing on your screen is the percentages from 2017. But I'll just note that in 2013, 30% of hubs reported offering packaging or repackaging services compared to 60% in 2017. For product storage, 58% of hubs reported offering product storage compared to 80% in 2017. So this seems to be consistent with an overall trend towards selling to more wholesale customers, which we see elsewhere in the data. Looking at marketing services, the orange bar chart, the marketing services that food hubs offer their producers and suppliers, we see it's common for hubs to support producers beyond direct purchases of farm products by, for example, assisting with marketing or brokering new market opportunities, which is the most common among those services. And next slide. So this will be our last slide for operational characteristics. And now we're looking at the customer types that food hubs are selling to and how that has changed over time. So we see that restaurants and direct-to-consumer have consistently been the most common customer types. However, over time, we're seeing increases in sales to most wholesale customer categories, with the exception of grocers. So sales to institutions increased substantially in every category except hospitals, which was flat. And the percentage of hubs selling to distributors and processors increased notably in 2017, which may reflect the beginning of a trend towards food hubs' partnerships with other supply chain intermediaries. Hubs selling directly to consumers through a variety of channels decreased. However, I should point out that the 2017 survey changed the way direct-to-consumer sales were measured. So this latest version of the survey combined 7 distinct categories into a single direct-to-consumer category. So that might have affected that comparison a bit. All right, now we're going to turn to food safety. Next slide. So I'll just highlight a couple things in this section. So first, the top bar chart shows the proportion of hubs requiring GAP and so good handling practices, good agricultural practices, and group GAP. So proportion of hubs requiring these certifications increased slightly in 2017. However, as in 2015, hubs are still more likely to require internal monitoring methods than GAP or GHP. The bottom bar chart here is showing us that between 30 and 53% of hubs have internal food safety monitoring requirements for at least some of their producers and suppliers. And I didn't include a visual for this, but I'll also just note that about half of food hubs are requiring food safety training for at least some of their producers and suppliers. All right, next slide. The last point that I'll highlight on the topic of food safety, we see hubs are continuing to support producers and suppliers' engagement with food safety practices. So again, another way that hubs are demonstrating their mission to support farmers. And then upwards of 1/3 of hubs are engaging in these different ways to support producers in meeting food safety standards. All right, we can go to finances. So this is the third of our 5 main topic areas. So looking at gross revenue, we see the average gross revenue from all sources was $2.4 million per hub in 2017. That's compared with $3.3 million in 2013 and 2015, so a bit lower. However, 2017 had the highest median revenue of all 3 survey years. And medians are important when we're discussing finances because they're less sensitive to outliers. And as you'll see when we get into the finances more, there's a big range in gross revenue across our sample. This chart here is showing gross revenue by revenue category, which has been fairly consistent across the 3 survey years. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to look at revenue by other categories: years in operation, legal structure, and business model. So in the report, this is all presented in one table, but just for legibility in this format, I've broken it into 4 slides. So we'll just take it piece by piece. So this is for the overall sample. Again, the median in 2017 is higher than 2015, but a very large range, minimum and maximum, in both survey years. Next slide. So here we're looking at gross revenue by years in operation. And I would call your attention to the median columns in both survey years. You can look by row to compare the survey years, and we've noted the percent change in each category, but I think the key takeaway here is that in both survey years, we see a fairly steady increase in median revenue as hubs increase their years in operation. Next slide. So here is by legal structure, and again, I think it's most useful to look at the median columns. So in both 2015 and 2017, we see that for-profits have the largest median revenue, nonprofits have the lowest median revenue, and then cooperatives fall in the middle, so closer to the lower end. But notice the ranges here, again, are very large, with for-profits a range from less than 1,000 all the way up to 90 million. Okay, next slide. Gross revenue by business model, there's less of a clear picture here, although we do see that the median revenue for wholesale hubs was highest in both survey years. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to look at where that revenue is coming from in terms of the gross sales portion. And here I've put the average percentage of total gross sales by customer type next to the average percentage of hubs selling to customer types. So we saw that chart on the right earlier when we were looking at operational characteristics. But looking at these side by side, we can see that prevalence of hubs selling to different customer types does not necessarily translate to a corresponding proportion of gross sales. So for instance, large supermarkets ranked fairly low in terms of the number of hubs selling to that category, but rank fairly high in terms of average percentage of gross sales. Colleges and universities is the opposite. In 2017, we saw a jump in the number of hubs selling to higher ed institutions, but from the chart on the left, we see that this sector represents a smaller proportion of average gross sales. Next slide. So gross revenue is valuable, but often what is more useful is looking at what is called the operating expense ratio, or OER for short, which accounts for both revenue and expenses. So the OER is calculated by dividing the total operating expenses by total gross revenue. So when a business is covering all of its expenses with total gross revenue, the OER would be 1 exactly. A business with an OER greater than 1 means they have expenses in excess of their revenue and a negative profit margin. A business with an OER of less than 1 has a revenue in excess of its expenses and a positive profit margin. So to assess profitability, we're looking for hubs with an OER equal to or less than 1. So in 2017, we found that 2/3 of hubs, 67%, were breaking even or better. That's a little bit less than in 2015, which was 75%. So this could indicate that fewer hubs were profitable in 2017, but it may also reflect changes in the question format. In 2017, we changed the way that we asked about expenses in order to be sure that we were capturing not only individual categories of expenses, but total expenses. So it could be that the 2017 data more accurately captured food hub expenses, which would result in a lower OER for some food hubs. So something to keep in mind when you're comparing across the survey years. The other thing I have on this slide is reliance on grant funding. So in 2017, hubs' reliance on grants increased, but that could be a reflection of more grants being available, which we do know to be the case with federal grants over that time period. But even with the increase in grant reliance, we still see that 64% of hubs report being able to carry out their core functions without grant funding. And then furthermore, it's worth noting that of the 35 hubs reporting to be highly dependent on grants, 3/4 of those hubs were nonprofit food hubs who may be intentionally trading profitability for greater social impact. So might be seeking out grants to carry out some of those social mission activities. Next slide. All right, so now going back to look at OER by subsets of the total sample. So this table is showing OER by years in operation. And again, I'd call your attention to the columns. So it's not perfectly linear, but we do see an overall decrease in mean and median OER as years in operation increase. And we also see that the range tends to tighten up, and the high end of the range is a lot lower for older food hubs. So at the top of the table, you're seeing high-end ranges in the 3s, 5s, 7s, 8s, 7s, 6s. At the bottom, it's more like 1 or less. However, I should note that a correlation analysis of OER by years in operation did not yield a statistically significant result. But as I noted at the beginning, gross revenue was significantly correlated to the age of the hub in all 3 survey years. Next slide. So this then looks at OER for the subset of hubs that responded to multiple surveys. So the sample here is small, but I think this is really exciting because this is true longitudinal data that allows us to see how a specific group of food hubs are becoming more profitable over time. So for the 9 food hubs for whom we were able to calculate OER in all 3 survey years, the average OER decreased by 21% from 2013 to 2017. So that's good news for food hubs. Next slide. All right, this is our last slide in the finances section, which I think also bodes well for the sector. And here we're looking at how new hubs fund their startup expenses and how that changes over time. So notice the big jump in federal government funding in 2017, and notice also the decrease in founders or organizations' own capital in 2017, which drops sharply. So it appears that hubs are able to draw on a wider range of resources and look beyond their own capital to begin their operations. All right, we have 2 more sections to go. Next slide. So values and mission. So there's a lot in the report on this section, but I'm just going to highlight a few things here. First, survey data confirms that hubs are sourcing and selling locally. Not depicted on the slide, but I'll note that we found the majority of hubs report carrying exclusively local product in all major categories of food items. Upwards of 90% of hubs say they carry exclusively local product in the categories of eggs, meat and poultry, baked goods and bread, dairy products, and processed produce. But again, it was a majority in every category. Also, the proportion of hubs carrying exclusively local product has gone up in almost every category since the previous surveys, indicating hubs are solidifying their niche as local food suppliers rather than moving away from that. In addition to sourcing locally, hubs are also selling locally, as you see from the concentric circle diagram. This is showing the proportion of hubs indicating that the majority of their customers are within a particular radius. And majority in this case means at least 75% of their customers. This is very similar to what we saw in 2015. Now, new in the 2017 survey, we asked a question about if and how hubs are communicating product origin to their customers. And those responses are in the bar chart at the top of the screen. So we found that almost all hubs had at least one process in place to let customers know which specific farm, ranch, or supplier a product originates from. And as you see in the chart, using the invoice or other paperwork given to the customer is the most common means of conveying that information. And then finally, in a related data point, hubs are overwhelmingly sourcing from rural farms and ranches. We asked about rural location for the first time in 2017 also. And on average, 86% of the farms and ranches supplying food hubs were in rural areas. Next slide. So in order to look at the non-financial goals that hubs might include in their missions, we asked whether the food hub mission was intentionally related to 11 different value areas that you see listed there. And as you can see, we found that a majority of food hubs reported that each value area was at least somewhat related. Supporting producers by facilitating access to markets was the most common non-financial goal listed at the top. Addressing racial disparities was the least common non-financial goal, but again, still supported by more than half of responding hubs. And then we had an additional new question in the 2017 survey asking hubs whether they record metrics on their non-financial mission goals, and 54% replied affirmatively. So in future iterations, it might be interesting to see what some of those metrics are. Next slide. So hubs are also continuing to engage in other activities that may in some ways promote sales, but arguably also represent a social mission. So over 40% of hubs reported engaging in 5 different social mission activities, which provides evidence that hubs are putting mission-related values into practice. So they're doing more than claiming a social mission, they're acting on it, and these activities are some of the ways they're doing that. That brings us to our last section. Next slide. Last section of findings is networks, challenges, opportunities, and barriers to growth. Next slide. So first, looking at the top challenges for hubs over the 3 survey years, we see balancing supply and demand has consistently been at the top of the list. For the first time in 2017, we added an open-ended question to follow this question on top challenges, in which we asked hubs to explain specifically why they ranked the challenge they did the highest. And then in looking at those responses related to the challenge of balancing supply and demand, we saw 3 themes: supply limitations, so not enough product, not enough of the right kind of product, seasonality constraints, customer limitations, second theme, not enough customers, not enough consistent customers, customers want one-stop shopping, or customers don't understand seasonality. And then the third theme was supplier limitations, so working with suppliers who are not willing to commit to the Food Hub model. So from those open-ended responses, I think we can get a sense of why this has frequently been a top challenge, because there are so many dimensions to that issue of balancing supply and demand. Next slide. I think it's also interesting to note what was least frequently noticed as a top challenge. So this is the bottom half of that table. And the least frequent was maintaining product source identification. So a lot of mainstream distributors, it seems like, are reluctant to provide source identification to their clients, but food hubs here are showing that they're able to achieve this without a great deal of difficulty. Next slide. Okay, so now switching gears to look at what sources of information food hubs find most valuable. So overall, the proportion of hubs indicating an information source was important increased by an average of 42% across these 9 categories you see in the bar chart, suggesting that more hubs are seeking information from a wider range of sources, that more sources are available, that resources are becoming more relevant, or all 3. Another thing to call out here is that hubs that used formal networks or communities of practice ranked these considerably higher as a source of information, with a rank of 1.76 than they ranked informal networks, with an average rank of 3.38, with 1 being high and 5 being low. So this then highlights the utility of formal networks for learning and exchanging ideas. It might also be a reflection of the growing number of formal food hub networks, and we now know of at least 8 networks operating and at least 2 emerging to support food hubs. Next slide. So new in 2017, hubs were also asked about ways in which information is delivered and the utility of that information. So from that, we found that peer-to-peer information sharing is the most common, with 94% of hubs saying that they get information from peers, followed by 80% of food hubs saying they get information from webinars. And then this chart on your screen is showing you that peer-to-peer information is also, in addition to being the most common, it's also seen as the most useful. Next slide. So to close out this section, I'm going to touch on hubs projections for the future. So roughly 70% of hubs expect competition to increase for both new customers and existing customers. And then in this chart, we're looking at the percentage of hubs expecting competition by source. And we see that traditional wholesale distributors were seen as the largest source of competition, or by seen as a source of competition by the largest proportion of hubs, I should say. And we know from other research that wholesale and retail demand for local food continues to grow. But what we may be seeing here is hubs are beginning to encounter a more competitive food distribution landscape. So it could be that traditional distributors are starting to get into more local distribution of products, and that's what's reflected here. Next slide. So in addition to looking at how hubs perceive the landscape, we also asked about their market intentions for the next 2 years. And this table is showing the responses for wholesale hubs. So other than convenience stores and direct-to-consumer sales, 1/3 or more of wholesale hubs intended to increase their market share in all other listed market segments. So what we're seeing then is a desire to become more diversified, which we also saw among hybrid food hubs. Less so, however, among direct-to-consumer hubs, as would be expected given their business model. Next slide. So I just threw a whole lot of numbers and charts and tables at you, but just to close out, to highlight a few things, I think what is most exciting from the survey is the trends that we're seeing as hubs mature. So older hubs, we're seeing a larger mean and median number of employees, a larger median number of suppliers. They're more likely to sell to wholesale customers, particularly distributors and processors, higher median revenue, overall trend towards greater profitability. So really seeing growth and viability over time. And then I'll just close out with the last slide here, depicting the core concepts which we illustrated in the executive summary. So again, pulling across a lot of the data points that I just shared and additional ones that are in the report that I didn't have time to cover. These are what we felt like were some of the core ideas or storylines emerging from the data from the survey. So food hubs contribute to the economy. Food hubs are becoming an established sector. They still face viability challenges, but they are increasing their capacity to meet food safety certification demands. They're supporting the triple bottom line, and they're supporting farmers in an array of different ways. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to John, who's going to provide some further context.
Thanks, Kathryn. A lot of good information there. I guess I wanted to offer some cross-cutting points and reflect on the 6 years of study that's been done with the surveys, providing some context for food hubs that would complement some of the nuts and bolts and kind of getting into the weeds that the survey offers itself. Some of my points I think are going to replicate and reinforce what Kathryn said, but I also want to point out I think a couple of things that may not have popped out on what we've talked about so far. I mean, I think it's important for us to recall that food hubs really emerged as a strategy to drive a different way of doing the food system, right? That would shift benefits from just a for-profit stream that would create opportunities for others along the value chain, right? Which is no easy task, and it's using a market strategy or a business as an intervention tool, and at the same time, it's trying to compete with many businesses that don't absorb or don't embrace those missions per se. And so I think we need to just keep in mind that there's an evolution here, that it's a bit of an uphill battle, that it's a new reality, that we need to convince partners all along the food system and the value chain to embrace both the values and this way of doing business. So even despite that kind of what might be a tenuous scenario, I think it is the food hubs are becoming an established sector, which is one of the cross-cutting results that Kathryn pointed out. You know, it's an industry or a sector that's starting to mature, even though it's still young, and you would expect evolution and changes. And I think a lot of the points that were pointed out today represent those changes in supply and buyers in operations. I think hubs have really proliferated across the country. We see it if you look at this map. This is the USDA's Food Hub Directory, which has about 209 hubs registered on it. We know there are at least 390 hubs out there, probably more like over 400. So this is a partial list, but even so, you can see the distribution. is pretty ubiquitous, right? I think there's strengths in the Northeast, there's strengths on the West Coast, and there's strengths in the Midwest. I think there's more work to be done in terms of food hub investment and food hub model development in the mountain states and in the South, which have unique challenges, whether they be geographic or whether they be historical. So I think that's a place for us to focus and continue to evolve this work. I think from the data, we also see that the hybrid model, right, one that uses both direct marketing to consumers as well as to wholesale markets, is a pretty popular and successful model because it spreads risk. It allows you to use your assets in multiple ways. It allows you to access capital and various markets. And so I think we're starting to see, not starting to see, we're continuing to see food hubs utilize that. Even though they may be shifting more to wholesale, they keep those direct markets. And then I know of some hubs that are looking at it in a very analytical way and saying, you know, our profit center is really in one or the other of these, and we want to shift away and offer that market channel to say to somebody else that could benefit. So there's a lot of change going on there. I think this other idea of using volunteers shows up in the study itself, and we're seeing a decreased dependence on volunteers, which I think is another indicator of maturity in the sector. And we know that 80% of the respondents were within 10 years of startup, right? So we're seeing hubs staying in business. Fewer of them are with under 2 years. More of them in the survey are a little bit longer, so they're actually staying in business. And we saw more professional management coming into the sector. So I think it's important to kind of just reflect and say there's staying power here, resilience and evolution. At the same time, I think similar to one of the highlights that Kathryn made, food hubs are contributing to the economy, and the longer they stay in business and the more established they stay in their value chains, I think the more opportunity there is for that. At the same time, I think it represents a different strategy. The dominant strategy in economic development we know is an attraction strategy, where you bring in a large manufacturing plant or a large distribution center or something that brings jobs, and it's an imported, and that business is owned elsewhere. You know, food hubs and regional food systems in general offer an alternative strategy and a compatible one. It's not one or the other, it's both. I think we need to encourage developers, economic developers and community developers to embrace this grassroots, if you will, or homegrown approach that builds upon existing assets and distributes benefits. And we're seeing that. And I think it's clear that another one of the overarching results is that as the evolution goes, they still face challenges, you know, which one would expect. But having said that, over 60% are at break even or into the black of profitability, which is rather stunning actually for a social enterprise business that operates in a market dominated by very consolidated competitors. So I think it's actually quite good, especially since you have a range of business models, 35 in the survey that are nonprofits, that don't have just profit and viability as their ultimate goal. So, and we know that grants play a role here. The data for this year shows that grants are perhaps even a little more important than they were in 2015, mostly to meet that social mission component that so many embrace, as well as for startup capital, right? If it's out there, even for-profits can have access to federal grants for startup capital, which is a good thing. Moving on, I think food hubs and regional food systems really are putting into place a value chain philosophy. I remember about 10 or 12 years ago, this idea of value chain development versus supply chain development really emerged from a conceptual framework. And there were some observations of this in larger industries, but really not in food systems. And I think food hubs have helped us realize how you put into place in reality a value chain philosophy that actually becomes business-to-business relationships, right? Where we're seeing greater dependency and stronger communications across the supply chain partners and some level of shared value across that chain, whether it be a shared value around farmer support, around greater environmental outcomes, local economies, or equity. All of those are playing out in the data that we see here. Food hubs are, in another way we see it playing out, is that food hubs offer services to their suppliers. They're not just going for lowest price, they're not just expecting, they're actually building capacity on either side, whether it be in supply or in the demand sector. For example, we see them helping suppliers and producers find new markets, whether it be with their hub or whether it be elsewhere. Connecting producers to loans and to grants, helping producers develop their branding and their labeling, doing bulk purchasing on behalf of producers, and doing production and post-harvest handling. I mean, these are all things that hubs don't have to do. Oftentimes it will support the hub's business, but there are other times it's really not all about the hub. It's about that value chain. I think another thing that we're seeing in the sector is that hubs are learning to manage their costs. Small businesses, folks new to business, are not always the best at managing those costs. And in a very tight sector with very tight margins, that's something that has to evolve. And I think we're starting to see that. Some of the unique things that we're seeing that may or may not show up in the survey itself are hubs that are starting to work together to share the costs of distribution, or share internal administrative services, or even pooling product across hubs to get to larger markets, right? So we're seeing these relationships, hub-to-hub relationships in Colorado, in Virginia and West Virginia, and several other places across the country. We see them selling to distributors. We saw that in the data. That's a good way to say, we can do this part of this work best, and we can't do that part of that work very well. So let's let somebody who does that well do it well and pay for it, right? So it's a way of managing costs so that you can be more financially viable. I mean, I think balancing supply and demand, as Kathryn mentioned, still remains a big challenge. In many ways, this makes sense because it's out of the food hub's control, right? They can work up and down the chain, but ultimately it's out of their control. Whether it be the weather, whether it be the farmer, or whether it be shifting markets. So I think that's going to continue to be a barrier, and we need to work together to support food hubs managing that piece. I think I've got maybe another 2 minutes here. So I think another place that we need to put some more attention and get better on is around racial and gender equity. You know, a number of the food hubs have goals around this, they're mission driven around this, but it's a much smaller amount than it is, say, to benefit farmers. I think 20 to 23% of the hubs have missions strongly related to racial equity for either their producers or around food access. If we talk about somewhat related, their missions are somewhat related to racial equity and gender equity, it increases. So I think if we're really going to try to make a dent in many parts of the country that are around racial equity and around gender equity, we need to be more intentional about that. We need to use grant programs. We need to be, as purchasers, we need to be aware of that. As buyers, we need to develop materials and ways of working with producers that bring everybody into the supply chain. I think more investment from government, from foundations and others would go a long way in that area. The last point I think I want to make is around sustainable production practices. If you look at the data, most food hubs prefer some type of eco certification or animal humane certification, or even around social equity certification of some kind, but they don't require it, right? And why don't they require it? Because the market doesn't often make that possible. Either the supply isn't there, or the market isn't there, or the margin isn't there. You know, but I think if you compare those preferences and those demands with the more conventional system, right, the preference in the market share that does have certification is much higher among food hubs. And so I think to the extent that the market is allowing them at this moment, they are driving more sustainable production practices, probably more than a conventional system is. I think you see that strongest if you look at the data. Those required sections are highest around livestock, especially with antibiotic-free, certified humane, grass-fed, things like that, which I think shows a real consumer concern in that area. You know, the exception to that might be organic. We do see some hubs that are strictly organic or require organic, and I think that's great because it can drive some of those environmental outcomes that we want to see, but the supply has to be there, and it's not there in all parts of the countries. So that's a business decision that I think hubs have to make if they have that value. So I think with that high-level review, I think I'll turn it back over to Ellie to take us into questions.
Thank you, John, and Kathryn for diving into the data. I'm ready to go read the survey and keep learning more. So we have a couple good questions, and everyone who's listening, feel free to add them into the question box, and we'll see how many we can get to. But one question that I know Wallace Center has been thinking a lot about recently is about how food hubs and local food system infrastructure is whether or not we see it becoming a more accepted and viable economic development strategy. And I know that's something, yeah, that's important to Wallace. So John, maybe you can talk a little bit about local food as economic development.
Yeah, I tried to touch on that in my comments a little bit. I mean, the data shows that hubs themselves have a limited number of jobs, quite honestly, right? I think it was on, if I remember right, the median was somewhere around 6, 7, or 8, and the averages were somewhere around 16 or 18 because the ranges are so high. And I think, I think they can be a piece of that homegrown strategy. The longer they exist, and the stronger the production practices and things like that are in the region that the hub is, I think the larger it can be. For example, if you look at veritable vegetable out in California, right, 40, 50, $60 million hub with tons of jobs in a high demand area with a lot of product. So it kind of shows you what's possible. On the other end, a lot of hubs are smaller and younger, and they haven't reached that potential, and they might not have that potential in their own region. So I think it's a piece of the puzzle. It's a piece of that value chain, and it's not always. I mean, to be quite honest, one of the points I was going to make, but I didn't want to take too much more time, was around a food hub is not always the right solution. Right? You may have a regional food system opportunity for economic development, but it may not be a food hub. It may be building upon existing distributors and businesses you already have to bring out and to put them into that value chain, if you will, so that you get that economic impact. The last thing I'll say is I think we need to recognize that we all want economic impact, but we don't just want economic impact, right? We want quality of life. Our economic goals are basically a function of our quality of life desires. And so, quality communities, food access, it's a complex, I think, set of metrics. It's not just jobs and sales. There's some quality of life stuff that really does connect to that. So I think that's a frontier for all of us to think about, how we measure and represent this economic and community impact that we're looking for.
Thanks, John. We have another question about how old some of the older food hubs are and what some examples of those might be. I know that the term is new, but some of these businesses have been operating for at least decades.
Yeah, this is Kathryn. In this sample, the oldest food hubs have been operating over 50 years. We don't like to divulge specific names just for confidentiality purposes, but I'm sure you could find some of the older hubs and some of the other public directories. As you said, the terms are new, but not necessarily the practices.
Thanks, Kathryn. There's another question about the data, if there is a breakout of protein types. Do you compare fish to meat, and does the data get that specific on those types of proteins?
There is a distinction between seafood and meat and poultry in some cases, but meat and poultry are considered together, so we aren't able to look at specific subtypes within that.
Yeah, I think if I recall, the data shows about 20% of hubs are working in seafood, and I think much larger, I don't know, 60, 70, 80% are in other proteins.
Yeah.
So I think seafood is a real opportunity for some food hubs that have access to fresh, local, or regional seafood. Certainly the public demand is there. I think there's been this unspoken difference between regional seafood and regional terrestrial food, if you will, that I think we need to break down that glass wall and embrace seafood a bit more.
Here's another good question about the viability of hubs, and maybe in the data if there's any indication that a particular type of business model is more viable or sustainable than another type.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and I think we're able to speak to that a little bit with the depth of analysis in this report and looking at OER, the operational expense ratio by category and business model. But I think there is a real opportunity to utilize the data from all three surveys and conduct some higher level analyses that would enable us to dive a little bit deeper into that question. But I think I did show the table that showed for profit, of course, as you would expect, food hubs have a higher median OER than nonprofits. It's not entirely consistent year to year by, by business model, but it did seem like in both 2015 and 2017, wholesale hubs had the highest median OER. So I think we're seeing indications towards answers to that question, but I think there's, like I said, an opportunity to do some further analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that's true also. You know, interestingly enough, consistently across the survey, co-ops have shown us a much stronger OER. And I don't think we've been able to really ferret out why that is. I think, you know, we could certainly make some guesses, I guess you could say, in terms around access to capital might be easier, self-interest from grower members type of thing, a more direct connection to the hub itself. But I don't think we have that answer per se. I think the other thing I mentioned was I think the hybrid hub model, where you have both direct and wholesale, seems to be resilient and consistent in the data. So if that fits, again, I think you have to design your hub to meet your local conditions, right? You've got to do those feasibility and business plans to see what your unique situation is and design for that. And I think the hybrid seems to show up in those pretty consistently, but it may not be for all.
So we have a question here about methods around the mission question and the sort of focus areas of people's missions. Kathryn, could you talk a little bit about the questions that you asked to get people's sort of mission commitments?
Yeah, let's see. So I think, and this didn't end up in the report, but there was a question that was just open-ended that asked food hubs to share what their mission is. So there's, again, another opportunity to look a little bit deeper and do some thematic analysis on those responses. But the way that we tried to get at it also is in the activities. So first, different areas that missions are related to that John and I touched on, with racial equity being towards the bottom of the list and supporting producers' access to markets being towards the top of the list in terms of number of food hubs, indicating that that area was related to their mission. So that's one way we looked at that, and then also different social practices that hubs might be engaging in as a way of acting out social missions. But there is opportunity for further analysis, again, that we didn't even get to in this report, which in and of itself is quite lengthy. But as I had mentioned, we asked for the first time how hubs classified themselves in terms of enterprise type. So I think we could dive into that a little bit further and see if those categories really are appropriate ways to distinguish in terms of the types of activities that hubs are engaging in or the nature of their missions as related to those categories. Is there another component to that question that I missed?
No, I think you got to it. They were just trying to understand how you captured those, because they did sort of break out into categories that probably is not an exact, replication of the way people write their missions.
Right.
Okay, well, that's just about all the time we have for questions. First of all, I want to send a huge thank you to all of our panelists, Rich, Kathryn, and our own John Fisk for their presentations today, and also all the hard work and brain power that clearly went into conducting and analyzing this survey. I encourage you all to download the full study. We obviously barely scratched the surface today. There's a lot more data and analysis in there. That's definitely worth checking out. And I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of the hubs who participated in the survey. Obviously, good data is critical to our work and Michigan State's work, and we appreciate the hub's time and openness in participating in the survey. And with that in mind, I'm just going to give a quick plug to the 2018 Food Hub financial benchmarking study that the Wallace Center is currently conducting in partnership with Farm Credit. The financial benchmarking study is a complement to the study that we were just hearing about from Michigan State. And what's more, it provides hubs with an invaluable tool for understanding their business's own financial health. Each participating hub receives a free personalized report from Farm Credit on their own hub's financial performance in relation to the benchmark. So if you participate in the study, you can just go to this URL listed here, bit.do/foodhub, and that'll bring you to the studies portal. You'll be asked to answer a simple series of questions and to upload a few financial documents that you should have on hand from filing your taxes in 2017. Participating takes about 15 minutes, and if you participate by next Wednesday, you'll be entered to win a door prize that all Food Hub managers can get excited about, which is a cool bot that can turn basically any small space into a little extra cold storage, which is really important to a lot of hubs, I know. Another little announcement from Wallace Center. In case you haven't heard, in January, the Wallace Center launched the Food System Leadership Network, which is a national community of practice to support staff and leaders of nonprofit community-based organizations working on food systems change. There's no cost to join, and there are lots of services and opportunities available. Already, we have over 1,000 members from all 50 states, which we're very excited about. One of the offerings of the Food System Leadership Network is a nonprofit bootcamp e-learning series that's dedicated to improving the organizational capacity and effectiveness of nonprofit community-based organizations by sharing nuts and bolts strategies and best practices in nonprofit management and operations. All of the courses are taught by seasoned food systems leaders who have practical expertise in the field. Our final course in the spring series is called Legal and Financial Essentials, and it begins May 2nd at 3 p.m. And will run for 3 consecutive Wednesdays. In this course, Poppy Davis, who's an expert on agricultural business and policy issues, will dig into the various legal, accounting, and financial aspects of your nonprofit. It's a great opportunity for nonprofits working in food to learn fiduciary responsibility, accounting requirements, and more. You can follow the link on the screen to register or head to wallacecenter.org to learn more. Lastly, the Wallace Center, through its National Good Food Network, has been presenting these high-quality webinars for several years now, and they're all archived on the NGFN website. You can go directly there by visiting ngfn.org/webinars. You can also find the Wallace Center and National Good Food Network on our websites and on social media. You can even email us at contact@ngfn.org. Let me remind you one last time to take 2 minutes to fill out our post-webinar survey that should open in a moment to help us keep improving our webinars in the future. And thank you again to our presenters and for all of you taking the time to listen to this webinar today. Have a great afternoon, and this concludes the webinar.